printer. I just found your really helpful YouTube videos online. Bless you. Thank you. I've been in limp mode hell with my printer for like 4 years. Many stops, misdiagnosed it. That's literally a new turbo, but by the time Mercedes was telling me I needed to replace turbo number 4, I was like, pause on the game. I'm no professional, but something's killing turbos. I got to go deeper. And they dismantled the exhaust and looked at the DPF filter and said it's clogged.
I get calls like this more often than I'd like, this being a little more extreme of an example. This thing makes your turbo go vroom and whoosh. And as you can see, it is very broken. Now, this one broke all by itself. However, I broke this other one on purpose, just for this video. Now, the dealership won't sell me this little piece without buying a whole new turbo. This little item costs about 50 bucks. New turbos, they generally cost thousands. Now, when I say fix your own van at the end of my videos, I mean every word of it. And if you aren't convinced yet that you should be fixing your own van, well, what I say next will make you change your mind. So let me show you 3 ways that your turbocharger gets misdiagnosed as bad. Let me know if a story like this sounds familiar. You feel your van just isn't running right. You take it to the shop and say, well, it just doesn't accelerate the way it used to. Then before you know it, you get told it needs a new turbo. But if it really did need a new turbo, you would know that before you took it in, as it would be making all kinds of crazy sounds. So you know something just isn't quite adding up. Now, before we take a look at the most common ways that your turbo gets misdiagnosed, I really feel like I need to emphasize that I'm no longer the only one ranting about this issue. Channels like Kits Automotive have dozens of videos about how these turbos get rampantly misdiagnosed. All that to say, this is a real problem that needs a real solution. And I'm not the only one blowing the whistle on how thousands of these turbos get misdiagnosed every single year. To understand why your turbo isn't working the way it should, we first need to look at your exhaust system. Now, what the heck does a clogged up exhaust have to do with the bad turbo? Now, I couldn't really find any useful diagrams on this, so I kind of had to make my own. I really just combined a few resources together, so really don't judge me on my editing skills here. This is what happens when your turbo works correctly. Low pressure, fast, bulk moving exhaust on this side makes high pressure on this side. So this exhaust turbine spools up this intake, and then we get nice high pressure after the turbo. Simple enough. So if you don't have a clogged up exhaust, your turbo is able to go vroom, whoosh, and pressure builds up here. The air on this side of the turbo gets packed in nice and tight, and your acceleration works beautifully. Now, compare that perfect scenario to a scenario where you have a clogged up exhaust. When your DPF is all clogged up, you no longer have low pressure on the exhaust side. High pressure, slow moving air through here can't spin this turbine fast enough, and therefore less pressure builds up here. So exhaust back pressure is a very real issue. If your exhaust can't move, your acceleration will suffer. So as a general rule, make sure the pressure across this device is less than about 2 psi. Simple enough, right? And most importantly, do not touch your turbocharger if you have exhaust codes. If you take away anything from this video, take away that one sentence. If you have a clogged exhaust, don't let anyone touch your turbocharger. So okay, that's kind of the easy part. And by the way, if you're curious about what causes a clogged up exhaust, go ahead and click this video here. But hang on, what if we don't have any trouble codes for an exhaust and your exhaust back pressure isn't an issue? Why would we still get a misdiagnosed turbo? So no exhaust codes, and still the shop's telling me, hey, you need to get a new turbo. And that's that. Well, then we need to dig deeper and see if there's things like a boost leak. And just to be clear, a boost leak would exist on the high pressure side of the turbo intake. So if pressure's building up here, okay, but we have a leak somewhere here, then obviously we're going to lose pressure. And that's no good for our acceleration. Now I go over the most common places boost leaks occur in this video here. I'll also link another video here on how to find the really tough ones using a smoke test. But if you do want to diagnose your boost leak without doing any work, the easiest way is to grab your scan tool and graph boost requested versus actual boost receiving. If those values aren't lining up, then you know something's wrong with your boost. So ECU requests a certain amount of boost, and then your computer is also reading through the boost sensor here. Now, what's that now? You don't have the right scan tool? That's okay. This video here should have you covered. You can do this with a cheap $50 scan tool, by the way, so don't let cost be an issue. Okay. Hang on, you might say. There's no boost leaks and no exhaust codes. And still the shop is telling you that thing needs a new turbo. Why? What possibly could it be? Well, I saved the best for last. And that brings us back to our turbo actuator. This thing regulates how fast your turbo goes whoosh. Can these go bad? Sure they can. But they usually have a diagnostic trouble code to tell you that they're bad. And they're pretty easy to independently test. I'll leave the pinout here. And if a shop or dealership tells you they can't replace this $50 part without replacing your whole turbo and charging you thousands, my suggestion is run and run fast. This thing is held in by just a few little bolts and really only takes about 20 minutes to replace. So take your damn van to someone who really knows what they're doing, or better yet, fix your own van. By the way, if you need a video on how to find a Sprinter mechanic in your area, go and click here. Okay, turbo actuators. Can they go bad? Sure. Do they go bad? Usually not. It's usually your ECU telling this thing not to go up and down. Generally, it's your engine computer telling your actuator arm not to go up or down because your engine is in some sort of low power mode. And if you're not sure about the different types of limp mode, go ahead and click this video here. Okay, enough self-promotion. Why on earth would my engine computer tell my turbo not to spool up? Well, there's a whole number of reasons for that, but the most common of which that I've found is some sort of MAF code. That is a code for your mass airflow sensor. Now the mass airflow sensor sits right here, and I'm noticing I don't have it on my diagram yet, which we'll have to fix in post. So, boom. Now, these MAF sensors can go bad as well. In my experience, it usually takes about 100 to 150,000 miles for these to go bad, and it generally happens in hotter climates. And if you want to see a great video that goes in depth about this sensor, go ahead and click here. But don't condemn this sensor just yet, especially if it's accompanied by an EGR code. Way too often these MAF sensors get misdiagnosed. So let's go back to the whiteboard here. Here's something that most Sprinter van owners don't know, and that is the crucial way your engine computer compares the air volumes before your turbo and after your turbo on the intake side. So your MAF sensor combined with a pressure sensor as well as a temperature sensor that's really inside the MAF sensor. These three things come together and create a very accurate idea of the total air going into your turbo. It then compares that total volume against the pressurized air mass after your turbo, utilizing your boost pressure sensor and a temp sensor. Okay, if all that's a little too much, I get it. I don't blame you. All you need to know is that the total mass of air on this side of the turbo needs to equal the air mass on this side of the turbo. Good so far, awesome, because we're about to throw a wrench into this whole thing by introducing your EGR system, aka exhaust gas recirculation. All it does is recirculate a small portion of the exhaust back into your intake. Simple enough, right? Keep in mind, this is a precisely calculated amount of volume in the form of exhaust that the computer also accounts for. So if your EGR is working properly, no problem. However, if it's not working properly, if this component is leaking or not opening and closing correctly, then too much exhaust will flow back into your intake, resulting in a mismatch between this air volume and this air volume. And that's how an EGR code can be the reason for a MAF code, especially if you're getting the code mass airflow offset drift at idle or mass airflow offset drift under load. Those are two extremely important ones. Okay, we're tying this all back to that turbo actuator not going up and down. This limp home mode that is triggered, that is characterized by a difference in mass air volume between here and here, is characterized by that turbo actuator not spooling. So if your computer is seeing a mismatch in that air volume, it's not going to request any boost. Confused yet? Good, because we're about to simplify everything. If you have an EGR code, don't touch your MAF sensor until you fix your EGR. And here's a video on how to remove a stuck EGR. Most importantly, if you have a MAF code, don't let anyone touch your turbo until you get that code fixed. Let's add a diagram to really help burn this into your memory. Exhaust, boost leak, EGR, then MAF, then maybe actuator. But of course, at the end of the day, this all depends on the codes you get. Alright, so once you confirm your shop didn't diagnose any of this and just said, oh, turbo's not spooling up, needs a new turbo, you're gonna take your van home and fix it yourself, right? Right? But wait, what if you tell me they're beyond sure that the turbo's bad and they have proof? Well, what does a bad turbo even look like? Well, I want you to keep one thing in mind, and that is physical damage. You should be able to hear and see a failing turbo. It should look something like this and should sound noticeably different. There should either be extreme play on the turbine or visible damage. And don't you dare just settle for the claim that it leaks oil. Just because there's some oil collecting around your turbo does not mean that it's leaking. In fact, there's really only one way to confirm that your turbo leaks oil, and that is to remove the intake. Remove your intake hose, make sure there's nothing around that turbo, and start up your engine. Intake hose is removed. That way you know there's absolutely no oil going into the turbo, and yet you can see here there's a small bead of oil going out of the turbo. Keep in mind, engine oil does run through the turbo in order to keep it cool and lubricated. So if you see a bead of oil coming out here and you're confirming there's no oil going in here, then you know for sure that your turbo is leaking. This is your PCV hose here. It's one of the most common ways a leaky turbo gets misdiagnosed as leaking, given that this exists to pull the crankcase fumes out of your engine block. And along with the crankcase fumes, there's always a bit of evaporated oil. Now I go over the importance of this valve in this video here. A lot of times a leaky turbo gets misdiagnosed because oil vapor fumes get pulled up here and you see some oil sitting here. If you see oil sitting somewhere here on the turbo, you cannot confirm it's leaking. It's perfectly normal to have a bit of oil there. But if you do happen to confirm your turbo's leaking a bit of oil, should it then be changed? Sure, you could argue it needs to get changed or repaired. But chances are that's really not the reason you're experiencing laggy acceleration. So yeah, it should be repaired eventually, but you should really just treat it as a separate issue that can be figured out later. Focus on what's causing your turbo not to spool up, not on the fact that it's leaking a bit. So get the power back in your van first, then worry about the leak. With few exceptions, and maybe your actuator's gone bad and you just want to replace the whole thing, that could make sense. But in general, don't replace your turbo even if it is leaking a bit. Save it for last, or repair it. Phew, okay, finally we're gonna land this plane, so to speak. We're gonna bring everything together. The final question we need to ask is what causes your turbo to break? And apart from it being starved of engine oil, it's almost always this cheap plastic intake hose. Given that it sits on top of your engine, it can get really hot and brittle over the years. Maybe it gets removed and put back too many times. Regardless of what it is, it will develop cracks. This almost always happens at the connection point to the turbo. And remember, once it develops cracks, all kinds of dirt and sand can get pulled into the turbine and really chew up the turbo and its seals. Needless to say, this part should be checked every year or so, and it should be included in this diagnostic process, especially if you run your van more than 10 hours per day. Now, if you don't want to fork out almost $200 for a new intake hose, I'll link an aftermarket repair option here. Keep in mind, I haven't tested this yet, and it's a little more hacky, so to speak. So this repair really isn't for everyone. Just know that next time you fork over a big expense at a dealership or an independent shop, and you tell yourself, well, at least I'm getting it fixed right, or you assure yourself, well, you get what you pay for, I need you to know that you're probably lying to yourself. Remember, part of having a healthy turbo is making sure your emissions are working flawlessly. Here is a video where I discuss how one small, cheap $13 emissions component can cause thousands of dollars in damage. And as always, fix your own van.